evening to fellow South Africans. In a moment when our nation has to make some very important decisions about its own future, Build One South Africa has always committed ourselves to working with fellow patriots who want to build a great nation, a nation that can prosper, a nation that will ensure that ultimately those who are unemployed would find work, a nation that will make sure that no citizen goes to bed hungry in the face of poverty, and ultimately that as we look at a budget, it must give expression to a sense of growth. It is why as Build One South Africa we've convened today. We met today because at one level, we have a meeting later on this evening with the African National Congress and a number of political parties to be able to discuss, crucially, what submissions will ensure that as we adjust the budget, that we can get rid of the 0.5% VAT hike. In expression of votes, we were clear that ultimately this is a historic issue. It has arrived on our doorstep where you've got a limited fiscal wriggle room, inherently because of a history of money having been stolen, but secondly, of economic growth that has been growing at less than 1% in the last 10 years. This has been a mismanagement of the economy. And ultimately today, as we begin to chart our way forward, we have to not only give expression to what happens in the budget, but we have to ensure that we reset the economic policy so that we take it going forward. Later on this evening, fellow South Africans, we will make submissions. We'll make submissions that say, how do we focus on growth? How do we adjust the budget? And where do we go from here? Let me be crystal clear on a few things. The first is that this current budget impasse is not just about a 0.5% increase. It is, in fact, about resolving an economic crisis, making sure our country can grow, and ultimately a government that's been in paralysis in the absence of a credible economic plan. South Africa is indeed, like any other economy in the world, facing profound headwinds. And therefore, we can't continue in moments of uncertainty. It takes parties like BOSA to say, let us step in, let us lead, and let's ensure that we can take this country forward to be able to grow an economy that creates the jobs necessary at the scale that is required. I'd committed myself before. I will work with parties that are committed to this vision. And I include today that we are willing to work with parties like the NC parties in the GNU, whatever the reconfiguration looks like. We are here to ensure that we grow the economy, grow South Africa, eliminate this 0.5%, and then take it on from there. So, whilst we cannot solve all the problems, let us choose the pathway of growth. And ultimately, let's ensure that year on year, South Africa grows. I also want to highlight the fact that the budget is an expression of a medium-term budget policy statement. It's measured over 3 years. So the decisions we make today need to also be reflected not only in this year, in the middle year, and in the outer year. It is what we are working towards. So we don't take the conversation that is taking place now as a short-term intervention only, but it's also a medium-term intervention to ensure South Africa works. So in looking to the build-up of last week's vote on the fiscal framework, BOSA set out a fairly responsible and a twofold approach. We understood the fact that the fiscal framework is not perfect. We understood the fact that this is something that will need to be changed, but a disaster would have occurred had it been that the fiscal framework had not gone through. Would have literally meant you are dealing with a country and a budget, a country that is without a budget, a country where come the new financial year, departments would only be able to spend 45%, and ultimately a country and a budget and an executive that could lead us effectively now to a point of proper economic disaster. As responsible citizens, this is something we could not afford we had to work to ensure that we take the journey forward of South Africans. Rejecting the framework at that stage would have put South Africans at proper risk, delayed social grants, disrupted the functioning of schools, hospitals, and police stations. You choose the path of leadership, and when others have chosen the path of chaos. This is not the South Africa we need to build. And therefore, our submission and our support came with a number of conditions that we need to put forward so that we get a better understanding as to why this process of passing the budget is so fundamental to where South Africa goes. I'm going to allow our deputy leader to take us through some of those, and then I'll talk through what are some of the budget cuts that we can ensure that the change that is needed to achieve so that we reduce this VAT issue is effected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the members of media that are here, and to South Africans at large. I think I want to start by firstly underscoring the importance of, in this moment, having chosen what our leader has duly described as stability, as responsibility for the country. And I want to start by saying that there are many arguments that say that the government would have been able to access 45% of the previous budget in order to keep the country moving. But the reality is that that provision would have only been for 4 months. It's only April to July. And also it would have been only on essential services and goods. It wouldn't have been on productivity, on any spending that actually contributes to productivity and growth. And South Africa simply can't afford to have 4 months where that isn't happening. So those are the realities, and those are the issues we had to take into consideration, into deep consideration. And those are the part of the things that we had to consider in terms of the stability, and part of the issues that we had to consider in terms of ensuring the stability of the country in voting for the fiscal framework. Now, as the leader has mentioned, there were also conditions that were on the table. The first is to say that these conditions are about a review and an adjustment of the fiscal framework within 30 days. And so we remain engaged on these conditions and alternatives. And as our leader has said, even tonight, we're engaged on the alternatives that we're putting on the table. And we have remained engaged even throughout the course of last week. The first is that we have been clear that a reversal of the VAT increase has to happen. We've been clear that VAT disproportionately affects the poor and working class households. We have duly campaigned about this and on this issue across the country, and we remain committed to that. We are here this morning still saying that there needs to be a reversal of the VAT increase. This was one of the conditions upon which we supported that fiscal framework. It is an instrument that affects the vulnerable, but there's also the issue, additional to that, of income tax bracket creep, which then affects the middle class as well. And so we're calling for an immediate action to reverse the measures and protect the purchasing power of South Africans across the board. You speak of the vulnerable and poor communities, but also the middle class. Because not only do you affect South Africans when you allow for a VAT increase and for bracket creep, but what it means is that there is less available for consumption, and the impact on our economy is just dire when you have that. The second is that we put on the table a condition of a full review of government expenditure to identify where cuts can happen. South Africa's problem is just not only a revenue shortfall. We also have a serious challenge in South Africa that we're all aware of an inefficient and bloated government, of wasteful spending, but also of corruption. And so the second of the conditions is to make sure that you start to look at overlapping mandates where you streamline cabinets. There are various departments that have the same mandates, and you have expenses that are occurring in parallel form with mandates that are similar or the same for various government departments. There are vanity projects, there are billions that are being lost that could be redirected to education, healthcare, infrastructure, and job creation. And so we have laid down various adjustments that need to happen in that sense. And the last is that there needs to be an adoption of a national growth charter that will drive jobs in the country. We still have an incredibly high unemployment rate, close to 40% by the expanded definition, close to 70% for young people by the expanded definition. And so we need to be able to attract investment. We need to be able to create jobs. And a national growth charter would serve as a compact between government, business, labor, and communities, and set out practical steps that say, how do we reduce red tape? How do we attract investment? How do we promote and support SMMEs to reach this target that the NDP set of 90% of new jobs being created by SMMEs? How do you make that possible, and how do you boost investor confidence in the country? And so those are the three conditions that we set. Now, we've seen throughout media, throughout social media, that there has been a lot of politicking that has taken place. There are parties that have taken the road of using this moment purely for the sake of politicking. There are others who were going to support on condition that they got what they had wanted, which was not necessarily in the interests of South Africans. And these were not necessarily agendas that were for South Africans, particularly poor South Africans. And we've said that that's not how we work. Our decision was really about fixing the budget for the people of South Africa. And we've said we will work with any parties that are going to make sure that this budget is fixed for South Africans, and that it is a pro-people and pro-growth and pro-economic growth budget. We're now starting to hear some positive feedback. The people who are starting to see and understand and agree on BOSA strategy to tackle VAT responsibly within the budget process instead of putting the country into crisis. And one of the things that we do have to mention is that while there's noise even about the Rand and what has happened with the Rand, independent analysts have made it clear that that has more to do with tariffs than it does with localized issues, or than it does with the local politics of the day, or with the VAT hike. We know what is happening globally in the country, and that's why we're seeing what is happening with the Rand. We have a set of proposals that our leader will lay out shortly for us. It is for a fiscally responsible, pro-growth alternative to the VAT increase. We remain committed to this. And not only do we remain just committed, we have in detail and comprehensively set out what that would look like in order to save on expenditure, but also to increase revenue. I'll hand over to our leader to table those.
Thank you very much. In the light of the fact that I chair and lead the Appropriations Committee, the committee tasked with the duty of either to adjust, amend, or make recommendations on the budget, we feel it's important that Build One South Africa also be able to make its own submissions in this regard. And the work now begins in making sure that we have a budget that works. And I must reaffirm the fact that, as our deputy leader has indicated, that there is an appetite across all parties to find workable solutions. Parties that have remained inside and not become excited about court action, etc. These are parties that are committed to working together to achieve not only an efficient government, but a government that will see the reversal of the VAT hike, but also the sense upon which we can table better expenditure going forward. So in this instance, we've identified just close to about 120 billion rands. That is a combination of new revenue that can be delivered, and furthermore, that will ensure that we cut in the right areas so that we can invest more in growth areas. So let me put some of the proposals that we're putting forward. One is we think that the National Empowerment Fund, which has been given a new additional income of 20 billion rands this year, that would be phased out over 3 years, because we think the capacity of the NEF is not quite at the level that it can to spend up to 20 billion rands, and ultimately will not deliver the necessary jobs that we want. That begins in the expenditure side. The second is we believe that if we were to introduce a 6% sin tax for online gambling, which will then begin to include other revenue mechanisms. It is possible that through that, currently, that sin tax is only raising 4.35 billion rands. I think if it were to be levied at 6%, because at this point in time, it's only been levied at 0.1 and only on certain things. Now we want to declare all online gambling, sports bet, etc., to become taxed at 6% as a sin tax. That will raise our income, at least in the medium term, closer to about 85 billion rands. We hold the view that if you end the broken employment tax incentives, we will be able to free up 6.6 billion rands. That speaks to the issue of additional revenue that will come into our fiscus. We believe in the medium term, a number of key things need to happen. Part of the dilemma is not only when people talk about the size of the state, they forget the fact that ultimately our fundamental issue has been in middle and senior management in the hiring of government. Over the last 10 years, despite stagflation, which is a stagnant economy that's not growing at the right rate, some of the, as particularly middle and upper management staff, have received above inflation increases. And even in this current financial year, a 5.5% increase has been scheduled for employees in the public service. We hold the view that were we to freeze middle and senior management government hiring, this could deliver a 16 billion rand savings in the medium term. Secondly, we think if we were to cut bailouts to failing SOEs, then if you stop bailing out SAA and Denel, you will be able to deliver at least a 6.6 billion rand savings. A 2% efficiency cut for bloated provincial bureaucracies will deliver a savings of 15.3 billion rand. If we rationalize our diplomatic missions and cut VIP protection for politicians, we could be able to get round to about a 3 billion rand savings. If we downsize in the medium term the size of the cabinet and eliminate deputy ministers' positions, which is something we've always held, you will find a 3.9 billion rand savings into that. If you merge duplicative marketing agencies into a single trade and branding entity, that will bring us to about 5 billion rand savings. And ultimately, if we reform the road accident fund, we will ultimately be able to deliver a 20 billion rand savings. Fellow South Africans, I don't believe we have a tax problem. We have a governance problem, which we need to solve, an efficiency problem, and we need to ensure that we have a growth solution that delivers a South Africa that grows. We stand ready to work, as I've said, with all parties that are committed to a credible, inclusive, and growth-orientated budget. This is not time for political theatrics. It's not time for us to play games and say, well, this one said this, we'll go to court, etc. In the midst of global instability, South Africa needs to be able to deliver a budget that is stable, a government that is stable, that focuses on the future, do the appropriate savings that will go into that. And as a committee, we'll commit to reviewing all of those to ensure that this current budget is amended appropriately using legislative means, cut the expenditure, and achieve a South Africa where we don't need to see a tax hike, but we can truly focus on growth. So I call upon everybody, let's work together to deliver a South Africa that would prosper. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both our DPs, Nobuntu, and our leader, Mmusi Maimane, for taking us through the statement and also our submission. We're going to open up for a round of questions. I kindly ask that you just give your name and which media house you're from, and then we will respond accordingly. Thanks so much. I've got Kevin, ENCA.
Good morning, I'm Kevin from ENCA. I just want to know, Mr. Maimane and the Deputy, what are your options come the 1st of May and that VAT hike does happen? And the second question is, if you say that you're willing to work with partners, does it include or maybe have a possibility of you joining the government of national unity?
Okay, let me take.
Thanks, Kevin.
There's one.
Just name and media house.
Bulelani from SABC the 30-day review of the alternative budget proposals, is it not a futile exercise given that businesses are already informing their clients that the VAT hike will go ahead on the 1st of May? Is there sufficient time to actually reverse this VAT hike, as you put it?
Thank you so much. I saw that out of you.
Yeah, I'm kind of used to it. Mr. Maimane touched on it, on the global instability and what we see in the US at the moment. How would you approach, what role do you want to see South African political parties, all of them, play in combating what is coming from America down to the external economy?
What is? Sorry, I missed the last bit.
What is coming from, how would you like South African parties to respond to what is coming from the USA specifically, but also the global instability in general?
Okay.
Sure. We'll take those three for now, and then we'll have another round if necessary.
Kevin, I've sought legal opinion about how we can be effective at being able to deal with the deadline of the 1st of May. There are a number of processes that have to be based in law about how we can adjust the VAT. Part of it, which is part of the suggestion, is to adjust the fiscal framework on that perspective, in which case that sits well within the Ministry of Finance to be able to do that. And I think Parliament would be jointly on this matter. The second is whether it were through whatever happens in the court ruling, I would think that it would be difficult for a court to be able to tell a government what taxes it must levy. You can argue the procedural question, but it would be a classic case of judicial overreach where it be that the court could tell Parliament or tell any government what taxes it should levy. So in essence, it is, in its truest sense, a parliamentary process that we must get on with it. I'm of the view that an adjusted fiscal framework is possibly one of the ways we can be able to explore, and there must be a conversation with the Finance Ministry in this regard. So I'm confident that in the midst of the 30 days, that conversation is well within our means to be able to have, and we are working with legal advice as to what the best route we can go from there. So the option would be either to table a fiscal framework or ultimately work with the Finance Ministry about a way forward. But I certainly think between us and the parties that are working on this, a solution must emerge. And I think if I touch on to Bulelani's question, Bulelani, companies have to communicate to their clients naturally. Let me use a different adjustment, which is when the SARB decides on the repo rate. You and I know when the SARB says we are keeping the repo rate at X, adjusting it to Y, companies immediately send out communication to that, and your bond repayments are recalculated instantly on that basis. So whilst I get that companies have communicated, they still will need to be guided by a decision of Parliament, and the adjustment is not onerous. I don't think it's that onerous for a company to adjust it way it calculates VAT. It's just a computing solution that you then send out the same communication to citizens to say VAT will be calculated at this rate or at that rate. So whilst I get that there's been mass communication from companies, I actually think that as South African in business, this exercise is done regularly, even on issues like the repo rate when it's changed, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't see that too much. And also I do think were we to see a reduction in the VAT, to now send an early message to citizens to say, actually, we found a way to reduce VAT, I think consumers would welcome that decision and companies would be enthusiastic at doing that rather than, just saying it's a technicality. It's not. These are computing issues that we can fix going forward. So I'm not anxious about that, Bulelani. I think that's important. I think, Jan, to your question about stability, the absence of a fiscal framework would have been more devastating towards stability. The instability within the GNU must be something we resolve soon and quite urgently. Because whilst many people would like to bake in the idea that all of the currency issues, etc., are baked into domestic issues, I agree with you that there are many international issues that we've got to focus on. And what we need is a government that acts as a unitary voice to take this battle forward. Therefore, in the light of that, I think we must settle whatever the impasses sit. We must decide on a government that is stable and moves forward. I have already said we need to find a deal with the USA. And they are our second trading partners, second highest trading partners. Therefore, it's important that we find an agreement and a deal. We need to set a pathway in the next year of creating policy certainty. And ultimately, the fundamental question for South Africa is that how do we increase gross capital formation or direct investment, both foreign and domestic? And that has to be predicated on a stability of government, policy certainty, and a message that goes out there that South Africa needs to be the place you invest on. And so that's got to happen within the next 30 days. So the review isn't just a VAT issue. The review is also about that stability, that going out to strike a deal with the US, make sure that we focus on growth and achieve stability in the nation. That's what we've got to look at. We can't be squabbling within in the midst of global wars, trade wars that are taking place, and tariff wars. South Africa has to fight for its own space, and I'm committed to saying, let's work here domestically to create that. And I certainly endorse President Ramaphosa in the work that needs to happen, and to ensure that we go out of our way to strike a proper deal with the US. I think that possibility exists. Hand over.
Sure. I think I would just want to underscore the issue of the communication that consumers have been receiving from a VAT perspective. Now, I think one of the things to bear in mind, Bulelani, is that we were previously in the kind of dispensation where the ANC had a majority. And whatever announcement that was made by the government then would always be endorsed by Parliament. And the difference that has happened this time is that an announcement was made by the minister, but we've now gone into a review of that announcement. And I think that is one of the things that we need to recognize as being a win in terms of this dispensation and of the representation that we have in Parliament, which is able to challenge what government says and is able to challenge decisions that are not pro-South Africans. And then there was a question on, and I'm not sure if it was covered by a leader, on whether we join the GNU, if that's part of the conversation. The reality is that we've always been clear, even right from the start. Part of the reason why we didn't join the GNU is that we didn't see a charter and we didn't see a plan or a roadmap that mapped out where South Africa was going. We didn't see an indication on what are the policies that this is going to be based on. And what is the growth path for South Africa? And so at this point, until such is there, that's one of the things that we'd want to engage on, and even that consideration. But I do want to make it clear that this decision was purely about the budget, that this decision was never about an engagement or bartering about the GNU. It was about making sure that we get what is best for South Africans.
Thank you so much to our DP and our leader. Any other questions? Sure.
Hi, thanks, Mmusi Babalo here from EWN. Just on tonight's meeting, just some detail. Is it a virtual meeting or are you meeting in person with the ANC to discuss these alternatives that you've just outlined here? And can you give us a sense what happens if your suggestions or recommendations are rejected? How does that impact the discussions going forward?
I don't know if there are any others. Yeah.
Sorry, Victoria Regan from Daily Maverick. Just to add on to my colleague, who initiated tonight's meeting, and also what immediate outcomes do you expect from tonight?
Sure. Any other questions? Going once, twice, thrice. Done.
I must apologize. I have a bit of a flu, so if I sound a little bit croaky, it's not because I'm trying to serenade anyone. It's just the flu has gotten a hold of me. But let me, first of all, tonight's meeting is virtual. It's not physical. And secondly, what is on the agenda tonight, there's been a number of issues that have been spoken about, both how do we work together to achieve VAT reduction, also what is then the way forward in the budgeting process. Because I think it's important to know that the budget is over 3 phases. The first is the fiscal framework, then the next is the division of revenue bill, which must come on board. And then the third is obviously the taxation bills, which are still to come. So those discussions are on threefold. It would be improbable that the report that our committee will put forward as the appropriations committee will not include any recommendations. The public have raised recommendations. Political parties have raised recommendations. The ANC itself has got a view on some of these issues. Therefore, I think it would be a bit a strange report that didn't make room for some of the amendments that are sitting on the table. So we're not playing for defeat, we're playing for a win here. And it's not a political win, it's a win for South Africans. So that's what we are working towards. And I think there's a collective enjoining of that spirit. If you remain inside the room, you can make these points. You can fight the issue. You step out of that, then your voice is outside where the actual... We've got to be responsible and work with what this budget book has indicated, amended, use the Money Bills and Related Matters Act to its fullest possibility. So I'm actually, as a South African, feel that it's an important moment for us. In the same way as no party got an outright majority, certain laws were never tested. Now we are arriving at the Money Bills and Related Matters Act and saying it gave Parliament the power to amend, to adjust, to make recommendations, and that's what will happen. And you'll also notice, Bula, and I think you know, when the budget is tabled, part of this issue is that the minister tables responses to all of these issues in the budget book that everyone gets furnished with. So part of this is the table. I mean, I'll use another practical example. Already Treasury have written to us as a committee to say there were certain things that there was an error, I think, in some of the budget issues. The only way they can amend it is that they can't do it unilaterally. They have to do it through our committee. So that shows you how the Money Bills and Related Matters Act actually operates. So we are coming to that place now where we've got to do that work. And I think, to me, that's the positive of staying inside, fighting, amending, making the changes, fighting for South Africans. That's what I think South Africans expect for their members of parliament. That's what we are doing. I think your question, Victoria, in terms of initiation of the meeting. We are in constant communication, and I'd had some conversation with the Chief Whip of the ANC, Honorable Ntuli, and post our conversation, it was then important that he called the meeting tonight, and he did. And I must concede and agree, he is the Chief Whip of Parliament. So it is well within his purview to bring everybody together, and because this is a parliamentary process. And we've had a very excellent working relationship with the Chief Whip, and we will continue to do so in this process as we continue. And I think it's right, he's hosting the meeting, we'll make the submissions and then take it on from there. My expectation is that we'll set up some form of a team that will work deliberately to say, let's then make the submissions more concrete, and then we take the matters from there. So I'm positive. I think there's a collaboration that works together with the team to make sure we achieve the changes that we need.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Jan?
Maybe a last one from me. Has there been any backlash from the public about supporting the fiscal framework that includes a VAT increase from now? Have you found people, regular members of the public, criticizing you? Thanks.
I tell you what has happened, and maybe I think RDP will respond to this as well. There has been a coordinated disinformation campaign that has been run by certain political parties. They have deployed online resources, bots, a whole ton of things, to really distort information. Some of these parties were happy. They made in their submission to say, no, we are fine with 0.5%, except we want other things. And so they've gone out, distorted information. And that's been the campaign. I think citizens out there want people who fight for them. So yes, whilst the distortions are taking place, misinformation, all of the above, we have to speak to South Africans about what we need to do in this moment. And I think you can't have it both ways, I'm afraid. You are either in fighting or out distorting information. And that's what we've experienced more than anything. Citizens, I don't want a 0.5% hike. My mother doesn't want one. South Africans don't want one. So, yes, that's why we are using all available means to say, let's adjust the expenditure framework, reduce this VAT issue, and work together. There are members inside the ANC who don't want this thing. So we are all clear that we are working in unison. But you can't just say you don't want VAT, but not also deal with some of the expenditure issues that must be adjusted for. Deal with what happens on that space so that you are responsible in your actions. But really, stability, responsibility, and being adult in the room is what's needed, not theatrics. And so that's what we've got to focus on now.
The only addition I'd make to that is that, of course, South Africans have been shocked and they've been startled and they've been angry. But a lot of this comes from 10 years of mismanagement. We can't ignore the fact that South Africans are actually, at this point, and not only with the VAT hike, with other issues that you see in that budget, being made to pay for corruption, being made to pay for mismanagement, being made to pay for inefficiencies. And that's the reality. So that South Africans are where they are today, and that we see the kind of anger that you've seen, of course, that's been fueled by disinformation. Of course, that's been fueled by unpatriotic postures that have been taken by some of the other political parties to cause that kind of instability. But the fact that that has happened is because South Africans have been burdened for a period of time. And so our approach has been to say, yes, let's deal with the issue of the VAT hike, absolutely, but let's deal with everything else that is in that fiscal framework. Let's deal with how do we start then to strengthen and how do we start to resource, for example, the SIU to ensure that there is no longer the kind of blatant corruption that we have and the wasteful nature of spending that we see within the ranks of government. We have engaged it to say, how do you then make sure that this budget is able to create employment? Because part of the frustration, and I was watching some of the videos on one of the stations, people responding to the VAT hike, and half of what they were saying is we actually don't even have jobs. So there's no ways that we'd be able to afford a VAT hike. So those are also the issues that this now helps us to be able to address together with the VAT hike. And people are starting to see that now, to answer your question, and they're starting to understand. They're starting to understand that this is a process, that what happened last week is not final, it's not a finality, and that we're engaged in the process. And as our leader says that we're in the room and we're in the room to fight for South Africans.
Let me just, I wanted to close just with this view. What is the long-term position that we are playing for here is important. I long for, given the fact that you will never have an outright majority, we want an executive that is stable. That's what we have to work towards. I would want an executive that then, whether it's through dialogue, the national dialogue, etc., produces a growth charter that says, here's how we're all going to focus, that works in partnership with all sectors of society to be able to say a couple of things that are absolutely crucial. The baseline infrastructural things are in place. Let's make sure the lights do stay on. Let's make sure water is flowing. Let's make sure the streets are safe so that potholes are dealt with. And for those South Africans who say, how do we shield the poor from hikes? I often say to them, actually, part of what is expressed in this budget is allocation that goes towards the transport ministry to ensure signaling works so that we can cheapen the burden of transport on citizens. Because even citizens who have a job, their biggest expenditure they face is 40% in certain instances of their money spent traveling to and from work. So when you deal with some of the negatives, also look at some of the things that are invested in this budget, because over the medium term, we'll spend over R1 trillion on infrastructure. This is investment that must ensure that we see economic growth, we see a budget that ultimately does not run a deficit year on year. So mine is to say, let us be a government that learns, let us build for South Africa. And that's what my job in the Appropriations Committee will be looking out for, is to make sure that that stability is in place, we get bang for buck in what we do, we focus on the right deals, and we grow our economy. So any delays, machinations, backwards and forwards, all of that isn't serving South Africa. The best way to serve the people of this country is to create stability. They must make sure they know we are in the fight for them. And for many poor South Africans, let's do our best to make sure that our hospitals work well, our public schools work well, and our police work well. And if we get those things right, it is the best way to shield poor South Africans from this global instability that we are engaged with. That's the work I'm committed to. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We appreciate it. I doubt if there's any, I think only answer you guys